patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and now we're on to Jacob's sons. And as you heard last week, Jacob had one son he treated differently than all the rest. Joseph was the youngest and the only son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. Now the son not only received preferential treatment and gifts from his father, he flaunted them, like a really nice embroidered coat. And he tattled on his big brothers, and he told them outrageous dreams, like the one where they're all out in the fields working, gathering up bundles of wheat. And he said that my bundle stood up straight, and all the others bowed down to it. How do you suppose the brothers liked hearing that from their tattletale brother? That they were tired of these antics, and so when they saw an opportunity to get rid of him, they discussed all kinds of ways they could murder him and get away with it. And then cooler heads prevailed, and they decided that instead of killing him, they would simply sell him to some traders passing by on their way to Egypt. And then they took Joseph's amazing Technicolor dream coat and smeared it with blood and brought it to their father and told him a wild animal had killed him. Jacob was beside himself in grief because his favorite son, the only son of his favorite wife, was dead. So meanwhile, the traders who paid 20 pieces of silver for Joseph arrived in Egypt, and they sold him to Potiphar, the commander of the royal guard and Pharaoh's chief officer. And Joseph performed his duties so well, he kept being elevated, and he was put in charge, and then he was put in charge of more until he was the chief of Potiphar's entire household. And then the story continues to describe Joseph was well built and handsome. Those words caught my ear. That's the Common English Bible translation. I was curious, how did the other translations describe him? And one said he was of beautiful form and of a beautiful countenance, and another strikingly handsome. But we're told this because this is the explanation for why Potiphar's wife grew infatuated with him and kept trying to seduce him. Now, all summer I've been telling you stories straight out of soap operas. But we might actually turn it around and say soap operas that come straight out of Scripture. Here's another. So Joseph kept resisting her. Sleep with me, she kept begging. It's Genesis 39:7. And one time she grabbed his garment and demanded passionately, lie down with me. Verse 12. She persisted, and to get away, he slipped out of his coat as she held on to it. Now, certainly that's happened on Days of Our Lives or one of the others. Well, realizing that he was never going to give in, she took that coat to Joseph's master. And then what started out as a kind of a funny story turned tragic. She lied. Look what the Hebrew slave did to me. He tried to sleep with me. I screamed, and no one was here to save me. He took off his garment, but when he heard someone coming, he ran off and left it behind. This is a sadly familiar story. Lies told in the South led to lynching. Like, he looked at me the wrong way, or he whistled at me. Remember, Emmett Till was beaten until he was unrecognizable, shot and thrown into a river with a metal cotton gin hung around his neck with barbed wire, because a woman said he whistled at me. A lie, creating a pretext. Now, in Joseph's case, he was put in jail. However, while he was in jail, Joseph so impressed the jail's commander that eventually Joseph, as a prisoner, was put in charge of the prisoners. And it was during this time that one day Pharaoh got angry at his head bakery chef and chief wine steward, and had them thrown in jail. And one morning they looked distressed. Joseph asked them, what's the matter? And they had both had dreams that they didn't understand. So Joseph listened and interpreted them, and in the end, the dreams became reality. Joseph said that the chief wine steward, would be praised by Pharaoh and restored to his position, while, and a warning to anyone who'd like to cover their ears right now for this gruesome detail, Joseph interpreted the dream of the bakery chef that his head would hang from a tree while birds pecked at it. Now, in reality, his head was only impaled on a stick, but it was close enough. The dream came true, it was reality. So the chief wine steward happily returned to work and promptly forgot the whole ordeal. 13 years passed. Joseph spent 13 years unjustly detained for that lie told against him. Another eerily familiar detail. So, one night, Pharaoh had two disturbing dreams. He stood by the Nile and he saw 7 healthy-looking, fattened cows grazing among the banks. And just then, 7 scrawny, terrible-looking cows emerged from the river and promptly devoured the fattened cows. And he woke up, troubled, of course. And when he could finally, eventually fall back to sleep, he had another dream. And this one was about 7 ears of corn, full and well-formed, and 7 scrawny-looking ears of corn scorched by the east wind. And the scrawny ones ate the full ones, but those pitiful-looking ears remained scrawny. Pharaoh was disturbed. He was upset, distressed, and he summoned all of the religious experts in Egypt and all of his advisors, and he described his dreams, but no one could interpret them. And that's when the chief wine steward remembered a young Hebrew in jail. So Pharaoh summoned him, and Joseph explained the meaning of his dream. 7 years of abundant fields of grain would be followed by 7 years of a devastating famine. And he told Pharaoh that he should find an intelligent, wise man and give him authority over the land of Egypt to collect and store as much grain as possible to last through 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh and his advisors thought, that's a good idea. And they put in charge Joseph. And just like he said, 7 years of abundant yields of grain did indeed lead to a period of famine that affected every part of Egypt and the rest of the known world. Every country had to come to Egypt to buy grain. And who did they have to see in order to do that? Joseph. So, back home, his father Jacob and his brothers were suffering the famine like everyone else. Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to buy grain. All of his sons except for one, because his beloved wife Rachel had one more son named Benjamin. But sadly, she died shortly after childbirth. And Jacob couldn't risk the idea of losing him too. So the brothers went to Egypt and they met with the man in charge of selling grain from their storehouses, but they didn't recognize Joseph. He recognized them, however, and devised a scheme seemingly designed to torment them. He spoke to them in a harsh tone and accused them of being spies for looking to exploit the country's weaknesses. And they defended themselves. No, we're just the 12 sons of a man in Canaan. Well, one brother is still back at home and one is gone. Joseph was that gone brother. This is also the first time he learned he had another brother. So Joseph told them that if they're honest men, go back home and bring the youngest son to prove that their words are true. But one of them would have to stay back and stay in prison. Reuben exclaimed to his brothers, "Didn't I tell you we shouldn't have wronged our brother?" But no, you wouldn't listen. That's why we're in this danger now. Now Joseph enjoyed listening to this little exchange among his brothers, and they didn't know he could understand their language. He had spoken through an interpreter as though he were an Egyptian. So the brothers didn't know he could understand them. But he sold them the grain, and Simeon was tied up and put in prison. But Joseph ordered that the money they used to pay for the grain be hidden in their sacks. And when they arrived home, the brothers told their father they must return with Benjamin in order to get Simeon out of prison. Jacob was out of his mind, fearing that he would lose yet another one of his beloved, most beloved sons, not to mention that now one of them was back in Egypt as a prisoner. It was then that they opened the sacks of grain and discovered all the money, and Jacob angrily accused his sons of trying to torture him. If anything happens to Benjamin, it will send me to my grave in grief. But they didn't rush back to Egypt to free Simeon because Jacob was trying as long as he could to wait and save little Benjamin's life. But when the grain was gone and they were hungry again, the brothers went back with Benjamin to buy more. So they arrived back in Egypt. They met with Joseph and told him about finding the money in their sacks and said, "We don't know how this happened, please." And Joseph, again through an interpreter, told them, "Don't worry about it." He invited them to his home, and he had a feast prepared for them, and he laid his eyes on his little brother for the first time. And then, there's always these little details that get tucked into some of these stories that I find amusing, and in this case, Joseph gave Benjamin 5 times as much food as the rest of the brothers, which is, he's still rubbing it in their faces. But they ate and they drank and they were put at ease. And while they were eating, sacks of grain were being assembled for them to take. And once again, Joseph ordered that their money be placed in the sacks of grain, along with a silver chalice in Benjamin's sack. Except this wasn't generosity. He did this to trick them. Joseph had his servants follow them, and before they left the city, accused them of stealing. "The master's chalice is gone. Why have you repaid his hospitality with such ingratitude?" That's when the brothers discovered money in their sacks of grain again. They returned to Joseph and defended themselves, saying they had nothing to do with it. But he said, "Oh, don't worry about it. But if one of you has my silver chalice, that one will become my slave." So from oldest to youngest, they opened their sacks until it was found in Benjamin's. And they all tore their clothes. Judah pleaded with Joseph that if they returned home without Benjamin, their father would drop dead of grief, and explained that Jacob had already lost a son who had been killed by a wild animal, which was Joseph, right, standing right in front of them. But Judah begged that he be kept behind as a slave instead of Benjamin because he couldn't go home and bear seeing the grief of their father. And Joseph could no longer control himself. He sent everyone else out of the room except the brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians could hear it. Remember, Joseph had been speaking to them through an interpreter as though he were an Egyptian. But as he broke down in tears, he said in their language, "I am Joseph. Is my father really still alive?" And the brothers were speechless. You heard how today's reading begins. Joseph said, "Don't be upset that you sold me. Don't be distressed. God sent me here to save your lives. Now go back and bring my father and your children and your grandchildren and your flocks and herds and everyone with you, because there are 5 more years of famine coming, but you won't starve." And he threw his arms around Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his shoulder. And then he kissed all his brothers and wept, and embracing them, and finally the speechless brothers could speak again. How often have you heard, "Everything happens for a reason"? It's a common sentiment meant to make someone feel better, but it's often the most egregious thing we can say to someone. Kate Bowler discovered she had stage 4 cancer. One day a neighbor came to her house with a casserole. It was a lovely gesture. And she handed it to Kate's husband with words of reassurance. "Everything happens for a reason." And he replied, "What is it?" And the neighbor looked like she didn't understand his question. "What is the reason?" And she dropped her eyes and stepped back. So we could look at today's story of Joseph sold into slavery and 13 years in prison and say, "See, everything happens for a reason. If the brothers hadn't done that to them, they could have died in the famine." Well, maybe that's true. But it is one thing for us to tell Joseph, that's why this happened to you, so that your suffering could save us. And it's another thing for Joseph to reflect back and say, you know what? Because of this, I can do this for you. Not everything happens for a reason. But everything that happens can serve a purpose. It is not for us to say to someone, you are suffering so that. But each of us can take the power and discern how, because of my suffering, I can. And isn't it liberating to know that every situation and circumstance that comes into our life isn't for a reason, judgment or condemnation for some fault or failure, but every situation and circumstance in our life can be redeemed, can be used for a purpose that helps someone. And I think that's the heart of Christian faith. It is the good news that throughout life we can take whatever happens to us, whatever someone does to us, including the mistakes we make, and we can turn that into an opportunity to serve. And it's in serving that we can find meaning for what's happened, just like Joseph did. Amen.